My name is Eva, and I've spent the better part of my 28 years perfecting the art of being invisible. If there were an Olympic sport for blending into the wallpaper or disappearing in a room with only 3 people in it, I'd have a shelf full of gold medals. I work in the basement of the Boston Grand Library, a place that smells of ancient dust, sweet vanilla, and the almond-scented decay of 200-year-old paper. To most people, this sounds like a tomb. To me, it's the only place where the world finally stops shouting. I'm a lead conservator, which is a fancy way of saying I'm a doctor for dying books. I fix broken spines, treat acid-burned pages, and heal the scars left by centuries of neglect. Books are my best friends because they never demand eye contact, they never interrupt, and they don't expect me to have a witty comeback ready at a moment's notice. I grew up in a drafty Victorian house where silence wasn't just a rule, it was a lifestyle. My father was a master clockmaker. I can still see him sitting at his workbench, a magnifying loupe pressed against his eye, his breath steady and slow as he manipulated gears no larger than a grain of sand. He taught me that the most important things in life happen in the tiny spaces between the seconds. He didn't speak much, and neither did I. In school, I was the girl who hovered at the edges of the playground, watching the other children play tag like they were part of a different species. When a teacher called my name, my throat would seize up as if I'd swallowed a handful of dry cotton. The heat would rise from my neck to my forehead in a violent, crimson wave, and the words would simply vanish. People assumed I was slow or stuck up or just plain weird. The truth was simpler. I was terrified of the vibrations my own voice made in the air. My laboratory in the library basement is my fortress. It's accessible only by a creaky freight elevator and a heavy steel door that groans on its hinges. Inside, the world is regulated. I control the humidity, the temperature, and the light. I spend hours under a high-powered lamp, using surgical scalpels and tiny brushes made of squirrel hair. I've developed a reputation for being the best in New England, mostly because I have the patience of a saint and the steady hands of a neurosurgeon. My boss, Mr. Henderson, is a man who seems to be made entirely of tweed and pipe tobacco. He's one of the few people I can tolerate because he understands the value of a long pause. He'll come down once a week, stand by my bench, look at my progress on a 16th century vellum binding, and simply nod. That nod is the highest praise I require. But lately, the silence of my sanctuary has been pierced by the cold, sharp reality of the world above. The Boston Grand Library, a landmark that has stood since the 1800s, is in trouble. Not the kind of trouble you can fix with a bake sale or a donation jar, but the kind involving predatory developers and city council members with short memories. They call it modernization. I call it a massacre. There's a plan to sell off the West Wing, the most beautiful part of the library, with its soaring oak ceilings and stained glass windows, to a company called Stone Creek Development. They want to turn it into luxury condos for people who probably haven't read anything longer than a social media post in years. The thought of those grand halls being carved into open-concept lofts makes my chest ache. But what could I do? I'm the girl in the basement. I'm the ghost who hides behind the inventory sheets. I don't go to meetings. I don't sign petitions. I just fix the books and hope the world stays outside the door. Everything changed on a Tuesday that started like any other. Mr. Henderson descended in the freight elevator, carrying a heavy, acid-free cardboard box. He looked more tired than usual, his bow tie slightly askew. "Eva," he said, his voice echoing in the stone room. "These just came in from a private estate. The Thorne family. They were among the original donors of the West Wing. The lawyers found these in a hidden compartment of an old trunk. They need to be stabilized before the collection is inventoried for the potential transition." He didn't use the word sale. He couldn't bring himself to say it. I opened the box after he left. Most of the contents were standard colonial-era ledgers, lists of shipping routes, timber prices, and livestock auctions. But at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of oil-stained silk, was a small, leather-bound volume. It felt different. The leather was dark, almost black, and the silver clasp was tarnished to a deep charcoal. When I touched it, a strange shiver went down my spine. It didn't smell like the other books. It smelled of sea salt and old secrets. As I carefully unlatched the clasp and began to flip through the pages, I realized this wasn't a ledger. It was a private memorandum book belonging to Elias Thorne, the man who had supposedly sold the land to the city in 1792. My heart began to drum against my ribs as I saw a loose flap of parchment tucked into the back cover. I reached for my tweezers, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know it yet, but that tiny piece of paper was about to end my silence forever. The parchment was incredibly fragile, its edges darkened by time and smoke. I placed it on my light table, the cool white glow illuminating the fibers of the paper. It was a letter, but not just any letter. It bore the official wax seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, dated July 14, 1792. As I peered through my magnifying lens, the elegant, looping script of the 18th century began to tell a story that contradicted everything the city council was currently saying. The letter was a deed of perpetual trust. It explicitly stated that the land Thorne was granting to the city was to be used solely and exclusively for the purpose of a public house of learning and a garden of quiet reflection for the common citizenry. The most shocking part was the reverter clause at the bottom. It stated that if the land were ever used for private profit or ceased to be a public library, the ownership would immediately revert to the Oglethorpe Community Trust, an organization that had long ago evolved into a local housing charity for the poor. My hands were shaking so much that I had to put the tweezers down. If this document was authentic, the city didn't actually own the West Wing in the way they claimed. They couldn't sell it to Stone Creek Development. It wasn't theirs to sell. It belonged to the people, or it belonged to the poor. Either way, it didn't belong to luxury condo developers. I sat there in the silence of my lab, the hum of the ventilation system feeling like a roar in my ears. I felt a crushing weight of responsibility. I was the only person in the world who knew this truth. Me, Eva, the girl who rehearses her grocery store interactions in front of a mirror. I looked at the freight elevator. I could just put the letter back. I could pretend I never saw it. I could let the West Wing fall, let the bulldozers come, and stay safe in my basement. That was the easy path. That was the path that kept my heart rate steady. But then I looked around at my lab. I looked at the 16th century manuscripts waiting for my help. These books weren't just objects. They were the DNA of our culture. If I let the library die, I was letting a piece of humanity disappear. The conflict inside me was physical. My stomach felt like it was tied in a knot of cold iron. I spent the next 4 hours doing what I do best, verifying. I checked the watermark of the paper, a small, crown-shaped mark used by a specific mill in 1790. I tested a tiny microscopic sample of the ink. It was iron gall, consistent with the period. I compared the signature of the city official to known samples in our digital archives. Everything was perfect. It was a smoking gun, hidden for over 2 centuries. By the time I finished, it was nearly 7 p.m. The library was officially closed. The silence was absolute. I took the letter and placed it in a protective mylar sleeve, then tucked that into my leather portfolio. I couldn't leave it in the lab. I didn't trust the security guards or the board members who were already picking out their new office furniture for the modernized wing. As I walked out of the library, the cool Boston air hit my face, and I felt like a spy. Every person walking by felt like a potential threat. I ducked my head, pulled my scarf tighter, and practically ran to the subway. That night, in my small studio apartment, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the lead developer, Marcus Stone. I'd seen him on the news, a man who radiated a terrifying, polished confidence. He had silver hair, teeth that were too white, and a voice that sounded like it had never known a moment of doubt. He was a predator of the modern age. How was I supposed to face a man like that? I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I saw a woman with messy hair, ink-stained fingers, and eyes that looked like they wanted to hide. "You can't do this, Eva," I whispered to the glass. "You're just the girl who fixes paper." But the letter was sitting on my nightstand, glowing under the lamp. It was a voice from the past, demanding to be heard. Elias Thorne had trusted the future to protect his gift. He had trusted me. I realized that my shyness wasn't just a personality trait anymore, it was an obstacle to justice. If I stayed silent, I was a co-conspirator in a crime against history. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for names. I needed an ally. I couldn't go to Mr. Henderson, he was too fragile, too close to retirement. I needed someone with teeth. I needed Sarah Vance, the head of archives. She was known as the Iron Librarian, a woman who had once chased a thief 3 blocks to recover a stolen map. She was terrifying, but she was honest. I spent the rest of the night typing a letter to her, deleting it and typing it again. Wednesday morning arrived with a gray, oppressive sky. I stood outside Sarah Vance's office on the 3rd floor for 20 minutes, my hand hovering near the wood, unable to knock. My heart was doing a frantic tap dance against my ribs. I could hear her sharp, rhythmic typing inside. Every time I gathered the courage to knock, someone would walk by in the hallway, and I would immediately pretend to be very interested in the fire extinguisher nearby. I felt like a fool. A 28-year-old woman, paralyzed by a door. Finally, the typing stopped. I heard the scrape of a chair. Before I could retreat, the door swung open. Sarah Vance stood there, looking exactly like her reputation, sharp-edged, wearing a charcoal suit, and eyes that could scan a document for errors at 100 yards. "Eva," she said, her voice like a crisp sheet of paper being folded. "You've been standing there for quite some time. The security cameras aren't just for show. Do you need linen tape, or is this something else?" I felt the heat rise in my face. My voice was a dry croak. I found something. In the Thorne collection. I held out my portfolio. My hands were shaking so violently that the leather was vibrating. Sarah narrowed her eyes. She didn't take the portfolio immediately. "Mr. Henderson told me those were just boring ledgers. Why are you bringing them to me instead of your supervisor?" "Because." I swallowed hard, forcing the words up from my constricted throat. "Because he wants to retire. And this might stop the sale." That got her attention. She stepped back and motioned for me to enter. Her office was a fortress of filing cabinets and rare maps. I placed the mylar-sleeved letter on her desk. As she read it, the room became incredibly still. I watched her face, the way her eyes moved back and forth, the way her jaw tightened. She didn't say anything for a full 5 minutes. She pulled a magnifying loupe from her drawer, the same kind my father used, and inspected the seal. "Where exactly was this found?" she asked, her voice low. "Tucked into a secret flap in the back of Elias Thorne's personal memorandum book," I said, my voice gaining a tiny bit of stability. "Box 42, Item C." I verified the paper and ink. "It's authentic, Sarah." Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring at the letter. "Do you have any idea what this means, Eva?" "Stone Creek Development has already paid the city a $10 million deposit. The mayor has already promised the construction jobs to the unions. This isn't just a piece of paper, it's a grenade." "I know," I whispered. "That's why I brought it to you." Sarah looked at me, her gaze piercing. "You're the shy one, aren't you? The one Henderson says is a genius with vellum but won't speak in staff meetings. Why are you doing this? You could have just filed this away and stayed in your basement." I looked at my ink-stained fingers. "Because the books don't have a voice," I said, my voice barely audible but firm. "I'm the only one who can hear them. If I don't speak for them, no one will." Sarah nodded slowly, a small, hard smile appearing on her face. "Well, Eva, it looks like you're going to have to find a very loud voice, very quickly. We can't go to the library board. Half of them have seats on Stone Creek's advisory committee. We have to go to the city council. There's an emergency public hearing tomorrow night regarding the zoning variance for the West Wing. If we present this there in front of the press, they can't bury it." The word press hit me like a physical blow. The press? Cameras? People? My lungs felt like they were shrinking. Yes, Sarah said. And you're going to be the one to present it. You're the conservator of record. You're the one who can testify to the chain of custody and the physical authenticity of the document. I can handle the legal jargon, but you are the witness. I can't, I gasped, the room's starting to spin. I can't talk in front of people, Sarah. I can't. My brain stops. I'll ruin it. I'll make them think it's a fake because I look so guilty. Sarah stood up and walked around the desk. She placed a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a soft touch, it was a firm, grounding one. Eva, listen to me. Marcus Stone is a bully. The mayor is a politician. They rely on people being too afraid or too quiet to stand in their way. You are the only person who can save this library. You don't have to be a performer. You just have to be a scientist. Tell them what you found. Tell them why it's real. Let the truth do the shouting. I left her office feeling like I was walking through deep water. The next 36 hours were a fever dream of preparation. Sarah and I worked in secret. She brought in a lawyer she trusted, a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the 90s. We made high-resolution scans of the letter. We prepared a technical report. And every hour I practiced. I stood in front of the mirror in the library bathroom, staring at my pale face. My name is Eva Miller. I am a lead conservator. I found the truth. I said it until the words lost their meaning, until they became a rhythmic chant. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. I was just a hollow vessel for a 200-year-old letter. Thursday evening arrived with a biting wind that swept through the streets of Boston, carrying the scent of the approaching winter. I stood in front of the City Hall, a massive granite building that looked like a fortress of bureaucracy. My legs felt like they were made of unbaked dough. Sarah was beside me, carrying a briefcase, her face a mask of grim determination. Deep breaths, Eva, she whispered. Remember, you're the expert. They're just politicians in expensive suits. Inside, the council chamber was packed. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and the hum of 100 different conversations. In the front row, I saw Marcus Stone. He looked even more intimidating in person, tan, perfectly groomed, and radiating a sense of ownership over the entire room. He was surrounded by a phalanx of lawyers and public relations experts. He looked at the library representatives with a bored, dismissive smile. He thought this was a formality. He thought the West Wing was already his. The meeting began with a long, tedious presentation by the development team. They showed glossy 3D renderings of the luxury condos. They talked about revitalization and luxury lifestyle. They had charts showing the tax revenue the city would gain. It was a polished, professional performance designed to make the destruction of a historic landmark seem like a noble endeavor. When Marcus Stone himself took the podium, his voice boomed through the speakers, confident and persuasive. He was a master of the room. He made everyone feel like they were part of a grand, inevitable future. When he finished, the council president, a woman with tired eyes and a sharp gavel, looked at the crowd. We will now hear from the public. Each speaker has 3 minutes. Please state your name and affiliation. A few people spoke, local activists who talked about the loss of public space, a few historians who spoke about the architecture. They were passionate, but Stone's lawyers easily brushed them aside with technicalities. Then, Sarah Vance stood up. My name is Sarah Vance, head of archives for the Boston Grand Library, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. We are not here to speak about architecture or aesthetics. We are here to present new, ironclad evidence that this city does not have the legal right to sell the West Wing. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Marcus Stone's smile faltered for the first time. The council members leaned forward. I would like to call our lead conservator, Eva Miller, to the podium to present the Thorn Deed of Perpetual Trust, Sarah said, turning to me. Every head in the room turned. The bright lights of the television cameras swung toward me, blinding and hot. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I thought I might faint right there on the marble floor. I looked at the long aisle leading to the microphone. It felt like a mile. I felt Sarah's hand on the small of my back, a gentle but firm shove. I walked forward. My heels sounded like gunshots on the floor. I felt like a ghost walking into a wall of fire. As I reached the podium, the microphone looked like a silver cobra. I looked at Marcus Stone. He was staring at me with a look of pure, concentrated hostility. He saw a small, shy woman with ink on her sleeves, and he expected me to break. He expected me to stammer and fail. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the high-resolution scan of the letter. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at the paper. I thought about the basement. I thought about the 16th century vellum. I thought about the silence of my lab. I realized that this was just another restoration project. The truth was broken, and it was my job to fix it. "My name is Eva Miller," I said. My voice was small, but the microphone amplified it, sending it echoing through the hall. I cleared my throat and looked up. I am a conservator. My job is to listen to the things the past has to say. 2 days ago, the past told me a secret. I began to explain the discovery. I described the hidden compartment, the memorandum book, and the letter itself. As I talked about the technical details, the watermark, the iron gall ink, the seal, my shyness began to recede. This was my territory. This was science. I wasn't a girl afraid of her own shadow. I was a professional delivering a report. I explained the perpetual trust. I explained the reverter clause. I showed the council the evidence of the Commonwealth seal. "The Thorne family didn't sell this land to the city," I said, my voice now clear and resonant. "They entrusted it. There is a difference between a sale and a promise. This city is currently attempting to break a promise made to its citizens 200 years ago. And as a conservator, I can tell you, once a foundation is broken, the whole structure eventually falls." The room was absolutely silent. I looked at Marcus Stone. His face was no longer tan, it was a sickly shade of gray. His lawyers were frantically whispering and shuffling papers. I had done it. I had spoken. And the world hadn't ended. In fact, it felt like the world was finally starting to make sense. The aftermath of my testimony was chaotic. The council meeting was immediately adjourned into a closed session. I was swarmed by reporters as I tried to leave the chamber. The flashes of their cameras were like lightning, and their questions were like a barrage of stones. "Miss Miller, how did you find it? Is the city lying? What's next for the library?" I felt the old panic clawing at my throat, but Sarah was there, her arm linked with mine, carving a path through the crowd like a snowplow. "No comments at this time," she barked. "The evidence speaks for itself. We will be filing a formal injunction in the morning." We escaped into the cold night air and retreated to a small, quiet diner 3 blocks away. We sat in a vinyl booth, the smell of grease and coffee a grounding contrast to the marble halls of City Hall. Sarah looked at me and actually laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from her in 3 years. "Eva, you were magnificent. Did you see Stone's face? He looked like he'd been hit by a freight train." I was still shaking, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea to keep them still. "I thought I was going to die," I admitted. My heart was beating so hard I couldn't hear my own words. "But you said them," Sarah said. "That's what matters." The next 24 hours were a whirlwind. The story was on the front page of every local newspaper. The shy conservator became a minor local hero. The community trust mentioned in the letter, the one that had evolved into a housing charity, immediately filed a lawsuit against the city, claiming ownership of the land. The legal battle was just beginning, but the momentum had shifted completely. Stone Creek Development issued a vague statement about reevaluating their plans, which everyone knew was code for running away as fast as possible. But it wasn't just the library that was changing. I felt a change in myself. I went back to my basement the next day, but the walls didn't feel like a fortress anymore. They felt like a home. I wasn't hiding from the world. I was just taking a break from it. Mr. Henderson came down, his pipe unlit for once, and shook my hand. He didn't say much, but the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. However, the quiet didn't last long. I received a phone call from the mayor's office. They wanted me to meet with their legal team to verify the physical evidence. Sarah told me I didn't have to go, that the lawyers could handle it, but I found myself saying yes. I wanted to be there. I wanted to ensure that no one accidentally misplaced that letter. The meeting was in a high-rise office building overlooking the harbor. I walked into the conference room, my head held a little higher than before. There were 6 lawyers in suits that cost more than my car. They tried to intimidate me with technical questions about the chemical composition of the ink and the storage conditions of the ledgers. They were looking for a loophole, a reason to call the document a fake. Miss Miller, one lawyer said, leaning back and tapping a gold pen on the table. You must realize how convenient this discovery is. Are you absolutely certain there was no outside influence? No help in finding this specific ledger? I looked him straight in the eye. My face didn't turn red. My voice didn't crack. The only influence was the preservation of truth, I said. Paper doesn't lie, and it doesn't have a political agenda. If you'd like, I can give you a 3-hour lecture on the degradation of 18th century cellulose fibers and why it's impossible to forge that specific watermark without a time machine. Should we start with the pH levels? He stopped tapping the pen. The room went silent. They realized that I wasn't a girl they could bully. I was an expert who knew her craft better than they knew their law. I left that meeting feeling 10 feet tall. I realized that my shyness had always been a fear of being judged, but when you are grounded in the truth, judgment loses its power. I wasn't just fixing books anymore. I was fixing the narrative of my own life. It took 6 months of legal battles, but eventually, the city officially withdrew from the sale. The Thorn deed was upheld in the state Supreme Court. The West Wing was not only saved, but it was granted a massive restoration budget to turn it into a state-of-the-art research center. Stone Creek Development moved on to a different city, and the mayor decided not to seek re-election for personal reasons. The library held a grand reopening ceremony in the West Wing. It was a beautiful spring day, the air filled with the scent of lilacs from the newly restored garden. There were speeches, music, and hundreds of people from the neighborhood. I stayed in the back, of course. Some things don't change. I was happy to watch from the shadows, seeing the children running through the halls and the researchers huddled over old volumes. Sarah Vance found me standing by the stained glass window. She was wearing a bright red scarf, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. They want you to come up and say a few words, Eva, she said, gesturing toward the podium. The Community Trust wants to present you with an award for your service to the city. I felt the old flutter in my chest, the familiar tightening of my throat. I looked at the crowd, the microphones, and the cameras. Then I looked at the books lining the walls. I think I've said enough for one lifetime, Sarah, I said with a small smile. I've given them the truth. Now I want to give them some peace. Sarah nodded, understanding. Fair enough. But you know you're the head of the new restoration department now, right? You're going to have to manage a team of 5 people. You'll have to talk to them. I laughed. I know. I've already started writing their orientation manuals. Very detailed manuals. With lots of diagrams. We'll communicate through a system of highly organized post-it notes. I still struggle with shyness. I still rehearse my phone calls before I dial. I still prefer the company of a 17th century herbarium to a crowded bar. But I'm no longer afraid of my own voice. I've learned that being shy isn't a weakness, it's a form of focus. It allows you to see the details that everyone else misses. It allows you to hear the quietest voices of the past. My basement lab is still there, but it's no longer a tomb. It's a workshop of the future. I have apprentices now, young men and women who look at books with the same wonder I do. I teach them how to heal the paper, how to preserve the ink, and how to listen to the stories. I tell them about Elias Thorne and the letter that saved a library. I tell them that sometimes the most important work happens in the dark, in the quiet spaces between the words. Every now and then, I walk through the West Wing and touch the oak shelves. I think about the day I walked down that aisle in City Hall. I think about the girl who couldn't speak and the woman who finally did. I realize that the world is a loud, messy, and often scary place, but it's a world worth being a part of. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to stand your ground, hold on to the truth, and wait for the right moment to speak. My name is Eva. I'm a conservator of books, a guardian of history, and a woman who found her voice in the basement of time. And as I look out at the sunlight streaming through the stained glass, I know that the silence I love is no longer a prison, it's a choice. And for the first time in my life, I'm perfectly okay with that. The books are safe, the library is full of life, and I am finally, truly seen.